Hey there, it's Kyle Boone, aka Strong Jaw, staff writer at CBS Sports. Welcome back to the Ion College Basketball Podcast YouTube channel. I've got my wonderful associate, Adam Finklestein, 247 Sports Director of Scouting, back with me today. So it's about to get nerdy. We're going to do some draft talk once again today. We talked Victor Wembanyama and Scoot Henderson last week. They had two exhibition games in Nevada, so we talked about that. Today, we are going to talk about a story that Finkelstein wrote that published at 247 Sports, talking about the NBA draft, some timeline behind the scenes, talked with some execs and some decision makers about that. So really interesting kind of behind the scenes reporting that Finkelstein did a lot of work on. So encourage you guys to go check that out. But first, Fink, I know you've been in Colorado Springs this week doing some scouting for 247 Sports. I have been absolutely inhaling all of the Carlos Boozer takes. So any insights to glean from Colorado Springs? I need all the Carlos Boozer insight that I can get from you.
Yeah, the Carlos was not there, but his sons were there. And Cam Boozer, how many times are we going to do that in the coming years?
A million times.
Yeah, Cam Boozer was terrific. He's right now the early number one in the national class of 2025, and he lived up to it and more. I think what people see on the surface is just the size and the inside-out skill set. I mean, he was making threes. He can be physically dominant in his age group in the block, but there's also a lot of nuance to his game. I mean, he's a big-time passer. He's got a terrific feel for the game. He communicates defensively. So he's got a mind for the game to match his physical tools and his skill set. So he's certainly going to be somebody that we're already excited about. And he was the talk of Colorado Springs this weekend.
For sure. Yeah. And so I watched the Redeem Team on Netflix last night. So easy to mix up. Saw a lot of Carlos Boozer last night. That's a really interesting show. If you have not seen it, this is not a paid ad, but I thought that was really interesting to watch, and really excited to watch Cameron Boozer, a guy who I think has a ton of NBA potential over the next few months, a few years. I think he has a really high ceiling. So let's get into it. You wrote at 247 Sports today about the NBA draft process, what it looks like during this time of year, how teams are forming kind of their opinions on each draft. So give us some insight into what went into reporting this story, who you talked to, and kind of some takeaways that you saw and were able to write about at 247 Sports.
Yeah, so the background was this: at 247, as we begin to kind of grow our draft coverage and think about what we want to do during the course of the coming year, I just didn't want to have like another mock draft. We've already got mock drafts in the CBS Sports family, and I wanted to try and give a behind the scenes look at really what goes on in an NBA front office. And I've got relationships and I've been a fly on the wall in some of those meetings, but I really wanted to go straight to the source. And so based on those relationships, what I did was a poll with 10 NBA front office representatives. Now, these representatives ranged literally all the way from a general manager down to a regional scout. So we cast a pretty wide net. And we asked them 4 basic questions. And the first one being like, hey, at this time of year, like, how do you organize your scouting efforts? Are they prospects in groups? Are they numbered? Is there a ranking system? And how does that evolve during the course of the year? Because, so often we've seen, kids who were this time of year who were labeled as surefire lottery picks who don't end up to be that, but yet they get kind of tied to that label and they've already made their decision that they're one and done. And then you see them fall out of the first round. They don't get guaranteed money. And now all of a sudden what appeared to be a trajectory towards long-term success really gets thrown off. And so that was kind of the hypothesis that I wanted to test against, was to see if some of these decisions or the things that are portrayed in the media as these foregone conclusions, how valid that was. And what I found inevitably is that it wasn't valid at all. All 10 teams told me that they do not have a ranking for this coming draft. And now when you think about it, there are mock drafts floating around on the internet for 2024. And I had not a single NBA team tell me that oh, my apologies. and
Part of the job.
And everybody told me like, hey, we don't even have a big board for 2023. In fact, there was one team, pretty high level exec, said, let's be honest, like at this time last year, no one had ever heard of Jalen Williams. No, he wasn't in anyone's top 30. He ends up being in the lottery. Instead, you've got guys like Max Christie and Pat Baldwin and Peyton Watson and so many of these guys who were supposed to be surefire lottery picks. And then shortly after the season began, it was supposed to be Trevor Keels and so many other guys. And he said, listen, that was all premature. And so the kids are making decisions based on this stuff. And lots of times it leads to bad outcomes. I had one exec, again, a high ranking guy, say that was the worst part of his job was to see, he said very matter of factly, and these quotes are all in the piece. He said that, unfortunately, some of these mock drafts, they're serving different reasons. They're either for entertainment. Some of them are influenced by the relationships. I had more than one person tell me that when the mock drafts come out, especially late towards the draft, the first question they ask themselves isn't about where a prospect is slotted, but about who the media person has relationships with. And so back to the original point, this executive said the worst part about his job is seeing kids making these decisions based on information that oftentimes doesn't align with what the league is thinking. And again, that can just lead to, really derail a prospect's trajectory and sometimes their career, unfortunately. So what we found is that this time of year, all 10 NBA teams basically subscribe to some sort of batching process or buckets. The words I heard most consistently were phase or tier. We've got 4 phases. We've got 5 tiers. And the vast majority of teams had 4 or 5. It wasn't until I interviewed the 8th person that someone said to me, like, yeah, you're probably starting to notice some commonalities here. And that's because there's such a heavy San Antonio OKC kind of spread within the front offices, with the other track being like kind of Daryl Morey and the people who have come up under his leadership. And so it was really, really interesting.
So they put guys they don't necessarily rank guys, right? Like it's way too early to do any type of mock draft, which again, guilty. I think it, as someone who does them even now, it's more geared towards like giving fans an idea of who's on the radar, not necessarily like, hey, I talked to this executive and this is what's expected. It's more of, at this point in the year, like your own personal big board mixed with like team name logos next to it. It's fun to look at. But on the NBA side, they're not even worried about that stuff, but they do have guys on the radar, and they've maybe broken them out into different tiers as like, these guys are maybe, returning guys who are really interesting. These guys are, maybe one and dones, or, they batch them in certain ways, not necessarily ranking, but it's their own system that we don't do as media, but it's more complicated. It's more nuanced than maybe what we do. And I think it gives maybe a little bit more insight into what NBA teams are doing.
Yeah, that's it. Batching is exactly the word I would use. And
okay.
My theory, as I said, it was someone just the other night, one of my last interviews said to me, is like, you're probably starting to notice that there's a lot of teams that operate with 4 or 5 tier systems. And a lot of that is rooted in kind of the San Antonio system that OKC and Sam Presti kind of tweak to make their own. And then other people, when they go off from one of those 2 front offices, they start a similar system, but they tweak it and make it their own. So there's a very common kind of system in place with 4 or 5 systems. I've talked to other front offices that didn't do that at all. But they're very clear trend with this 4 or 5 buckets initially. And some of the commonalities, because everybody does tweak it over the years, but you have a bucket for potential lottery picks. You have another
Mm.
bucket for potential first round picks. You have another bucket for potential second round or maybe two-way guys. Another bucket, I heard this a lot, for potential Portsmouth or G League Combine guys.
Mm.
And then a final one for start a file but push them to next year because we don't think we'll see them this year. So that to me was, and then there's flexibility in that as you go throughout the schedule. The follow-up question I asked for everybody is, at what time of year, because obviously they've got to put them in order eventually, right? And so my question was, all right, at what point does the buckets become a list? And the earliest answer I got to that was January 1st. And somebody said to me, he said that we bring everybody in for meetings on January 1st. That's where we do our initial rankings. And this is quoted up on the site too.
Yep.
He said, and when the scouts do those rankings, I'm very candid. I tell them matter-of-factly, don't talk to each other. I don't want you to share your rankings with everybody else, because if you guys all have the same list, it's just groupthink, and I don't need you all. So yeah. I thought that was very interesting. The latest that I had a team tell me that they start to rank prospects is right before postseason play in the NCAA tournament. So you're talking like late February, early March. So basically, you've got like an 8-week window where most teams go from kind of sorting these prospects into different categories and then putting them in some sort of numerical order as you get closer to the draft. And obviously, the later we get, the more those boards will start to evolve. And in terms of the mock draft, I did ask that question, like, do you guys have a mock draft? Some people literally laughed at that question. And others were more kind of, they said, listen, like, there's nobody does anything called a mock draft, but there's two things that's, two kind of aspects of the real process that represents. The first is some sort of big board, because we're all ranking our prospects and we're all creating a board. The second one is the ability to forecast what those around us are doing. And I had a number of people talk on the record about that, because that becomes very relevant, being able to gather the intel and project what not just the teams in front of us are doing, but the teams behind us, as well as like who's motivated by what. Do you have to win right now? In which case you may be more willing to deal your picks. Or is it the opposite, where you're just in rebuild mode and you're trying to acquire picks? So those were kind of the two aspects of the mock draft that people said that is kind of based in reality. But the other interesting thing is, of the 10 teams I talked to, only one said, oh, we don't look at that. Everybody else said, yeah, we look at the mock drafts. We don't care where they're ranked. That was pretty much unanimous. But we want to make sure that there's no name in there among that 30 or 60 that we're not aware of.
That's really interesting. So one thing that I think is really interesting that I kind of gleaned from this is, the mock drafts can be revealing to some extent, right? Because some media members have certain relationships with front offices or with coaches
or with agents.
Teams or with agents. There are certainly some motivations. It sounds almost as if teams are tuning into this not for the insight they can get on, like, hey, it looks like Chet Holmgren is going to be going number 2 or number 3.
Right.
Thunder are really interested. It's more of like, okay, how can we break down this relationship? Like, what are the motivations maybe behind either this media member pushing him at a certain spot? What is the motivations maybe why this team is projected to go this direction? It's almost as if there's a deep relationship analysis, more so than just mock draft analysis and where teams are going to go, because you can kind of game out where players are going to go. And I think to some extent that is important and it's revealing, because if you're picking at number 3, right, like, you want to know who's going number 1 and number 2, because you want to have an idea of who's going number 3. But I think it gets more interesting down the line when you're picking at number 13 or wherever, and you can't really game out how it's going to go, but you can have a pretty good idea, and some of the relationships and putting those pieces together can sometimes be just as revealing as what mock drafts or what big boards are looking like in the media.
Yeah.
It almost seems as if the influence of mock drafts and big boards is probably more relevant, maybe to fans. Like
Yeah.
it's more content entertainment. It's not necessarily all the time like, hey, this is gospel. This is definitely happening. Here's what's going on behind the scenes. But it does provide at least some insight, just maybe not the insight that people expect from it.
Yeah, 100%. In fact, I was just seeing if I could find it. I had somebody, because I asked them that, like, how much do you look at NBA draft coverage? How much do you look at mock drafts?
Yeah, I got the quote here. It says a lot of the mock drafts that get put out there have different agendas and are getting pulled by all sorts of people, whether it's team or agents. The thing that is tough is that the kids and the parents around them make decisions by these mock drafts, and there's a lot of times when it doesn't align with what the league is thinking. That can lead to a bad draft night and messing up a kid's career. That's the part of the process that is always difficult. People are making decisions based on these things, and they think it is real. It's a good index. This is further quote. It's a good index. It's a good index of potential names initially. As we get closer to the draft, we see names rise and fall or even disappear. We consider the reason behind the jump and who is friendly with the media person. There are some pretty notorious stories of that type of thing over the years. There's a hype cycle, et cetera, et cetera. That's
pretty crazy,
kind of,
right?
Yeah.
So I think that there were two common denominators there. Like early on this time of year, there were executives who acknowledged like, hey, we have different goals. Some is trying to provide entertainment and create clicks. Ours is to organize information and get it in front of our decision makers' hands. I thought that was another interesting point. But basically, this time of year, what does a media generated mock draft mean to an NBA front office? It's just something they're going to thumb through quickly to make sure they're not missing any names. As we get closer and the draft orders revealed, that's the time, and you read them there, two of the different quotes that allude to the fact that the NBA front offices, two different people told me those mock drafts are actually analyzed to see if it's a source of intentional misinformation based on who that media member may or may not have relationships with. And I want to emphasize, this isn't specific to any one media member. This is something that whether it's malicious or just human nature, because we all operate in the same circles. You know what I mean? The NBA front office, there's a reason why I had access to these front office people, because I know them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So but it is something that these teams are aware of. They're not worried about that order that's projected in the media at the end, but they are trying to figure out if it's representative of someone's interest, whether that is an NBA team or an agent. To that end, I had someone else tell me that when you see a anonymous scout quoted about a specific player down towards draft time, that it is almost always misinformation. This person literally said to me, if you see an anonymous quote saying, oh, this person's slipping, it's a good bet they are actually trying to make sure he's available where they are, because so many of those anonymous quotes are just them trying to utilize the media as a tool to get to the desired outcome that they are trying to get to.
Wow, that's really, really interesting. And it makes me kind of do some self-reflecting too, because I've definitely talked to some scouts who have.
You're an agent of evil, Boone. This was my whole point.
Yeah. Well, in hindsight, yeah. So I remember last year, not related at all, but I was very, very high on AJ Griffin. I don't know AJ Griffin. I don't know AJ Griffin's dad. I don't even know who his agent is. But I was really high on him throughout the process. And I remember you saying something like, are you AJ Griffin's agent or something? And I think I laughed it off because it's like you were obviously being funny. But there are people who intentionally or maybe unintentionally do that throughout the draft process, where they are friendly with an agent who, maybe will end up going like 20 to 25, but maybe someone is mocking them in like the 10 to 14 range. And there's like some motivations behind the scenes that, maybe we're just not aware of, we're not keen to.
Well,
Um, yeah,
that's what so many of these kids use as a barometer of whether or not they
right.
should go in the draft. You know,
Yep.
so if you're an agent, you're recruiting a kid and you're in a good position to get him, you want him in the draft
Yep.
more often than not. I don't want to say that every agent thinks like that, but it's kind of seems logical that an agent, if they think they are leading for a kid, they want that kid in the draft. What's the best way to get him in the draft? You get a mock tie. He and
Yep.
his family are going to be they're going to be impacted by that. And versus, hey, maybe he goes back to school and he repeats this process a year. He's got a whole nother year to reconsider his representation. That's not in the agent's best interest. And so there's and that's just one variable. I mean, there's the front office variables. Another thing that revealed itself that I didn't even really talk about in this piece, but the amount of intel that goes into trying to figure out how many kids would accept a two-way contract. I had one team, and I didn't write about this, talk to me specifically about Donovan Mitchell after his freshman year at Louisville. He declared after his sophomore year, and
Yep.
he was very candid. He said, "Listen, we tried to convince Donovan to go after his freshman year. We tried to tell his, the people around him, we tried to make sure they knew like we would take him in the second round because we thought a year from now he was a surefire first round pick.
Yeah.
So, and we weren't sure if we would be able to get him a year from now. So I thought that was really interesting too, because, like the NBA draft, it's, this is chess. It's not checkers.
Yep. Yeah, and there's so much information collecting behind the scenes that I don't think we fully appreciate. I've gotten messages from scouts and people in NBA front offices on just like the most random players and the most random tidbits of information. Like I remember one time, because I cover Oklahoma State and I'm from Oklahoma, I got a message from one scout asking me about Marcus Watson. I don't even know if you know who Marcus Watson is. He was, like someone who was ranked outside the top 50 like 4 or 5 years ago.
Right.
Really athletic, like maybe interesting, like future two-way player. Not really on the NBA radar, but like that's pretty standard fare, right? Like the information collecting behind the scenes is so much more in depth than just like, hey, here's a mock draft, here's a top 30. Like these guys, this ain't no hobby, like to quote Kevin Kisner, like this is their job. They're doing a ton of analysis and research on every single class, and it's probably like it probably flies a little bit below the radar because the media doesn't necessarily cover that stuff.
So there's a couple of things there, and you're hitting the nail on the head. And the first thing is that, and there was a quote about this very thing in the piece, because the last question I asked all these front office people is, what's the biggest difference between the media coverage and what actually happens behind the scenes? And while there were a wide variety of answers on that question, one of the most common ones is the amount of intel that goes into each kid. And I had one person tell me, definitively, he said, we're not just talking about the Paulo Bancheros and the Chet Holmgrens of the world. We're talking about the Harpers and the David Roddies of the world too. Mm-hmm. And he said, what you're seeing publicly is only the first layer, and we're about 7 layers deep. I had another scout operate on a similar type of methodology with that. And he said, listen, lots of times that first layer is the basketball stuff, and there may not be, that stuff may be pretty obvious, to the good evaluators who are there. So maybe what you and I are breaking down isn't all that different than what's going on in an NBA front office. The difference is that in the NBA front office, they're getting ready to make a multi-million-dollar investment. And so they are really digging deep into all of the intel in the medical. And again, a third person said to me, I actually wonder how much of that the media knows and just doesn't say because it's not a good look. Like if there's a history of something that provides a red flag, whether it's in, the personality traits or the intel or the medical, and, that's the kind of thing that's hard to communicate in the media, but the NBA is really, really digging into you. To your point about Oklahoma State, and I think this is really interesting, and this was, I would say, almost unanimous, is that so many of these front offices are so big right now. Well, once you get to the second round, the top decision makers, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, it's not that they're checked out, but they are less invested in the 57th pick than they are in the 3rd pick. So if you're an up and coming guy in the front office and you're trying to advance yourself, you're going to have more autonomy in the 2nd round, in the deep 2nd round, to make your call. And if you get it right, that is a great way to fast track your career. So I had a number of people talk to me about that, about the process of trying to identify the 2nd round pick who has a 3% chance of making it versus the one who has a 1%, not just because it's a 3 times the return on the investment for your team, but because personally for that scout, it is a great way to advance themselves.
Yeah, imagine being the guy who made the call on Nikola Jokic, right? Like, you got an MVP in the 2nd round. Like, that is that's a good way to jumpstart your career for sure.
Yeah.
Like, I would imagine probably higher ups were involved in that decision because it wasn't, like one of the last picks. But that's really good insight that gives, I think, some really important context to the NBA draft, because I think as a fan, probably a lot of people see mock drafts, they see big boards, they see scouting reports, and all that stuff is useful to an extent. And even NBA front offices are at least monitoring that stuff, even if it's only to just add another name to their list. But there is so much behind the scenes that goes on, the timeline on which teams operate, all of these different crevices and nooks that people don't really totally evaluate or consider during the NBA draft process. So would highly recommend everyone going to check that out. I am so deep into this content right now. Like, all of the quotes are really, really good. And the insight that you got from this is really fascinating. So good job, Fink, on that. Really
Thanks, Boone.
impressed.
Looking forward to reading your 2027 mock draft later today. Apologize.
That'll be coming out today. I got some Jet Howard thoughts. No, the mock drafts will still be coming. Definitely.
And let me, if I could, let me just clarify this, as they should, because there is there's a demand for both. Like, there is the people want to consume that stuff, and the web analytics would show that. But that's the whole point. It's not that we're saying like, hey, we're not going to do mock drafts anymore. I'm not going to do one. But you're still going to do yours. So the point is that you get both. You get the inside look at maybe how an NBA front office is approaching the process, and then you get the fan generated experience of like, which is for entertainment and names and an early glimpse and things like that. So there's room for both, certainly.
Yeah. And I think it's important, and most people, I think, when they do mock drafts are pretty clear, like, at this time of year, this is like, we study the draft, we study these prospects. These are mostly based off a big board that we maintain.
They have to, because we don't even know the order.
Exactly. And they change, they evolve, just as NBA teams, as is highlighted in the piece, change and evolve throughout the process. Basically the start of conference play is when NBA teams start to form some sort of ranking, not necessarily a big board, but they've got, these tiers, and they've separated them, and they've got a pretty good idea of at least at that point what they look like. And then, after conference play, they get another idea. After the NCAA tournament, they'll have another idea. So these things change and evolve. Obviously, there's more intel coming in as the season goes along, as players rise and fall, as the draft order looks like it will go. But really important, I think, reporting from you, because the nuance and just so many different things to consider with the NBA draft process that people may consider and they may know about. But something to keep in mind, I think, because we all love to follow the NBA draft. This is what we're doing. We're talking about it right now. But what is perceived in the media and what is reported in the media isn't necessarily what's happening behind the scenes. So very important context to add.
No doubt. I'll close with this. Is one very high ranking person told me, he said, you know why it's relevant? Because my owner's a fan and my owner's going to read the mock draft. So I better be ready to answer why the guy who's number 7 on one mock draft isn't in our first round projection. So there's all kinds of different variables that impact this whole thing. And I'll say this, it was a really fascinating deep dive for me to take over the last couple of weeks. to dive into this process. I was able to learn a lot. I mean, this is where our jobs are the most fun, where you're studying something that you're legitimately interested in, you're learning yourself, and then you're able to pass on what you've learned. And so hopefully I was able to do that.
For sure. Yeah, really appreciated that. So that was awesome. Yeah, I'll be sure to follow Adam Finklestein on Twitter if you're not already. It's at Adam Finklestein. He's got his story on the 247 Sports
Now I gotta find yours. What's yours?
I actually don't have Twitter. So
You're
don't
not
follow me on Twitter.
You're not on Twitter?
Yeah, I have a Twitter, but I'm not a good follow. I don't tweet enough.
You're on IG too, right?
I am, yeah, but it's just pictures of my kids. Or my kid.
Kid. I don't. You know what's interesting? Sidebar here, Nada. You can cut this out later if you want, Nada. But I do not put my kids on my social media, and like my wife and I are totally aligned on that. And everybody's like, "Why not?" And I was like, "Because I'm gonna rank some kid like 13th who's going to a school. The school's pissed, and all of a sudden they're gonna take it out on my kids. Like when they see him, like we are not doing that. Like just like the negativity of recruiting and draft content, taken out of my poor kids who don't know what the heck they're talking about. You know, like they don't even like basketball. Leave them alone."
Yeah, you post all of your like work content on Instagram, and my Instagram, like it's basically like just like high school friends and college friends. So I don't want to spam people with like, hey, here's my takes on Cameron Boozer. I think he's going to be a great prospect. Like, I don't think anyone really, they might care, but I don't think they really care.
So to summarize this podcast, I have criticized your mock drafts and you are criticizing my Instagram account. That's a wrap, everybody.
I'm jealous that you can do that on Instagram. Like I could do it. I don't think anyone would be interested, but you can do it. And like, you've got, hundreds of millions of followers and likes, and people are just like so invested in like no one cares what I think about. No one cares what I think about Jet Howard. Like I'll just post on Twitter and like people like it maybe.
But you know what? If you do post and they do care and they don't agree with you, then it's not like, hey, I'm not sure I agree with that. It's like you are the worst person ever. You should die a slow, painful death, which is exactly why I leave my kids off there. So.
Yeah, that's man. Wise words from Adam Finklestein. We're learning a lot from you today. This is great. On that note, we'll see you later. Be sure to follow. Yeah, on 247 Sports' main page right now, Adam Finklestein's story is on the homepage. We'll see when Nada publishes this, but be sure to check that story out. Leave him a nice comment on Instagram and Twitter while you're at it, and we'll see you guys next time.